The popularity of functional programming has been steadily building over the past few years, and for a very good reason, because functional techniques can help you write more declarative code that is easier to understand at a glance, as well as refactor and test. Now, one of the cornerstones of functional programming is how you work with arrays. There are three main types of operations: map, filter, and reduce, and wrapping your head around these operations will be very important as you dive into modern frameworks like React, Vue, and Svelte. I am Jeremy McPeak with Envato Tuts Plus, and in this tutorial, you'll learn how to use the map, filter, and reduce methods on arrays. But first, if you are looking to create a professional website or you want to add features to make your website stand out, then head over to CodeCanyon, the marketplace for high-quality JavaScript and PHP components, HTML5 and mobile templates, and so much more. The items at CodeCanyon can help you easily add the functionality and eye-popping visuals that you need to meet your business's goals. You'll find a massive library that contains thousands of JavaScript and PHP components and almost 20,000 HTML and mobile templates. Needless to say, you'll find what you're looking for to take your site to the next level. Let's start with map. Now, the purpose of map is to transform an array into another array, except that it doesn't modify the existing array. Instead, it creates a completely new array that contains just the elements that we want it to contain. So here we have an array of tasks. Each element is a simple object that have a name and duration properties. And let's say that we want another array that contains just the names. We don't even want an object with the name property, we just want the actual string values themselves. So of course, we can accomplish this in a variety of different ways. They all involve a loop, but there are, of course, different loops. We could use a for loop, we can use a while loop, we can even call the for each method on the array itself. Or what we could do is use the map method, because this is what the map method is designed for. So let's create a new variable, we'll call it task names. And we simply want to extract the names of each task. So we will call the map method, and then we are going to pass in a callback function that is going to execute on every element in the array. And we can work with up to 3 values within this callback function. The first is going to be the actual element itself, is that I'm going to just call it a task. So in this particular case, we want the name. All we need to do is return the value that we want to be inside of this new array that we are creating, in which case it's just going to be the name. So we want to return the name of that task, and that is going to give us an array that contains 3 string values. And that is exactly what we would want. Now, our callback function can actually have up to 3 arguments. The first is the element that we want to work with. The second is the index of that element. So if for whatever reason we needed to work with the index, that is where we can get that value. And then if we needed to work with the actual array itself, then we can do that with the third parameter here, that is the array. Now, this is of course how we would typically write this solution. However, let's simplify this. We don't need the index or the array, and instead all we really need to do is return a single value, in this case the name. So we could use an arrow function here, which makes this so much easier to read and to understand. And this is where we can start to see the benefits of incorporating functional programming techniques within our code. Here we have a very simple line of code that basically says we are taking the names of each task and creating a new array with that, as opposed to something like using a for loop or any other kind of loop where we are getting into the nitty-gritty of actually implementing that functionality. Here we are saying this is what we are doing, as opposed to using a for loop or any other loop and saying this is how we would do that. So let's go ahead and let's write out our task names to the console just to make sure that this code works. And of course it does. Here we have our array of 3 elements. Each element is, of course, the name of each task. So there we go. Now, when it comes to the map method, the main thing you need to be aware of is to always return a value from your callback function, because if you don't, then by default, you're going to end up with an array of just undefined. Every element would be undefined because a function that doesn't return a value returns undefined. So always return a value and you won't run into any issues there. So let's move on to the filter method. And as its name implies, it filters an array. Now, like map, it does not modify the existing array. It creates a new array that contains only the elements that we want. So here we have an array of words, and let's say that we want only the words that have 8 or more characters. Now, of course, we could implement this using any kind of loop, but once again, we want our code to be more declarative and concise. So we're going to call filter, and we will pass in a callback function. Now, this has the same parameter list as map's callback function. So we would have the element, or in this case, the word that we were working with, followed by the index, and then the array itself. And the return value is going to be truthy or falsy. If it's truthy, then whatever element we are working with is going to be in the resulting array. If it's falsy, then it will be left out of that array. So in this case, we want only the words that have a length of 8 characters or more, which I think there's only one, JavaScript. So if we wanted to view this in the browser, let's go ahead and do that. So we should only have one element in the array that says JavaScript. And of course, if we flip this comparison, then we are going to have several elements and JavaScript is going to be missing. Now, most of the time, you're going to be working with the first argument that represents the individual element. So let's go ahead and let's make this a little bit cleaner by using an arrow function, and we will be good to go there. Now, like the map method, you want to remember to always return a value, because if not, then it's going to return undefined, and that of course means that you'll have an empty array at the end of the filter operation. Unless of course that's what you want, which I could see some uses for that. But in most cases you will want an array that contains something. So be sure to always return true or false. Let's move on to reduce. Now, reduce can be a little confusing, not because of what it does, because it's very simple. It simply reduces an array into a single value. What can be confusing is that single value part, because remember that this is JavaScript. Anything can be a value. It doesn't have to be just a numeric or string value. It can reduce an array into an object or an array or even a function. In fact, one of the more common uses of reduce is to reduce multiple arrays into a single array. However, in this example, we are going to be much more mundane, and we are just going to tally up the duration so that we can get the total amount of time that these 3 tasks took. So first of all, we're going to implement this using the good old-fashioned loop. So we're going to show how this is done. So we will, of course, have our counter. We want to iterate for as long as the counter is less than the length of our array. And then inside of the loop, that's where the magic is going to happen. We are going to take total. We will take the previous value of total and add the current task's duration. And then at the end of the array, we will end up with a total of, let's see, that is 420. So there we go. It's a very simple idea, but of course, this is the kind of code that we want to get away from. This is the nitty-gritty, how it's done. We want to be much more declarative here. So we will have our total time. And whenever you call reduce, you are going to pass in a callback function. But the parameter list is a little bit different. The first parameter is the previous iteration's value, which we will talk about here in a moment. And then from here on out, it's just normal stuff. We have the current element, which would in this case be a task, followed by the index of that element, and then the array if we needed to use that in any of our operations. All right, so let's talk about this previous iteration's value. What in the world is that? Well, if you look at documentation, I think the official word is the accumulator. And yeah, that's fine. But this is basically our total here. So if we look at our for loop, every time we iterate, we are doing one thing. We are assigning a new value to total. And to do that, we are taking the previous iteration's total, adding the current task's duration, and then we get our new value of total. So In this case, our previous iteration's value, or the accumulator, is this right here. It's our running total. So in the case of our use of reduce, the previous iteration's value is our total. So the return value then is going to be the value that is going to be used in the next iteration for total, if that makes sense. So the return value, for all intents and purposes, needs to be this value here, that total. So in this case, we're going to return total, and we will add the duration of the task. So there we go. So let's write this out to the console, and let's see this completely and totally fail. And you'll see why. So here we don't end up with 420. Instead, we end up with a string. And it starts off with object, and then it concatenated the durations of the other two tasks. We have 60 and 240. So what in the world happened here? Well, total. We are performing an arithmetic operation. So that implies that we need a starting point for our addition, which whenever we used a loop, that was right here. We initialized total with 0. That's all well and good. However, we didn't do that when we called reduce. So here's what happened. Whenever reduce called our callback function for the first time, it saw that there was not an initial value for total. So it passed in the first object for total and the second object for task. So that's why in our result, we see object followed by 60. Because it's taking the total, which is an object, and it's concatenating the duration of the second object, which was 60 here. So then the question becomes, how do we initialize our value of total? Well, it's very simple. Reduce accepts 2 arguments. Now, the second argument is optional, but in most cases, you want to supply it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with results that you would not normally expect. So the second argument is the initial value for your accumulator. In this case, it's our total. So the first iteration, total, is going to be 0. And if we go back to the browser, we can see, voila, we have the value that we expected to see, 420. So let's simplify this a little bit. By using an arrow function, we don't need index or array. We don't need all of this other fluff. We just need this simplified so that we can put it all in one line to make it a little bit easier to understand. So there we go. So when it comes to reduce, there are 2 things you need to remember. First of all, just go ahead and supply an initial value for your accumulator. Now, yes, in some cases you can get away from doing that, but in most cases you're going to need it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something that doesn't work. So just always apply that second argument to reduce so that it will have an initial value for your total or your accumulator. The second thing is to return the value that you essentially want to reduce down to. So we are reducing down to the total duration. So of course that is our return statement for our callback function. And so now you know how to use map, filter, and reduce. Map transforms one array into another array. Filter, well, it filters an array according to your criteria, and reduce reduces an array into a single value. They are extremely powerful, and you'll definitely use them in your projects going forward. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. If you liked this video and want to see more, be sure to subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to learn more, check out the other fantastic tutorials that Envato Tuts Plus has to offer. I'm Jeremy, and I will see you next time.